I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old on Old. And this week, we're going to be looking at the 1934 classic, It Happened One Night. So, if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I break down a new classic film that I have never seen before, and I look at it from a 2018 viewpoint. I ask questions such as, does it hold up? And then look at some of the historical context as to why this film is a classic, and sort of give my opinions of a viewer of the first time. Now, I've seen a lot of major classics like Casablanca and Citizen Kane, but don't let that dissuade you. Comment below. Let me know some of the classic movies that you think are great that maybe I haven't seen, and comment below so maybe I can cover them for the next coming weeks. I want to create this really great film community throughout the comment section, not only just for my Oscars content, but also for this. And I've been having a blast with this series so far, just learning about all these amazing classic movies. And for It Happened One Night, it happened again. I really enjoyed this movie. I've seen a few of other Frank Capra movies, such as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and of course, It's a Wonderful Life. And this one was one that I knew was sort of a big Capra classic, and one that sort of cemented him as a large director, especially sort of the pre-World War II era. He was very much a big director. And later, you know, he had a couple of flops, but that still doesn't dissuade him from the amazing movies he made. I know It's a Wonderful Life, for example, was made after World War II. But this one was made before, and was actually the start of what's called the Screwball Comedy. Now, if you don't know what the Screwball Comedy is, we've actually covered it before on the episode of His Girl Friday. His Girl Friday is also a screwball comedy. Now, a screwball comedy is not a genre like the noir, where we don't really see noir at all today, but it's a different genre. It's sort of like a romantic comedy, but also has some more elements to it. If it were to be released today, it'd be sort of a unique type of romantic comedy. And It Happened One Night, specifically, for a screwball comedy, if I were to sort of define a screwball comedy, think of His Girl Friday, of course, but there are some elements to it that make it different than, say, a romantic comedy, but make it different than, say, a satire or just a pure romance movie. First of all, it's always comedic. There's always comedic moments. For example, this movie was actually released before the Hays Code, which, if you don't know, I feel like I'm talking about it every week, but it's this production code where it was actually started to be enforced in 1934, where we saw a lot of these movies, and movies in general, they had a code, which means that they had to follow a certain set of guidelines that sort of stop them from saying certain things or alluding to certain things. And if a character did something, they would have to follow certain people's wishes, or if they were a murderer, they'd have to get their up and comings at the end of the movie, things like that. So it was sort of a restricting element, but this was actually before it. So they're able to get some really sort of raunchy things going on. But going back to the screwball comedy element, of course you have that comedy, and then you have the romance that eventually sort of builds throughout the movie with two people, sort of an unlikely couple, whether that be just viewpoints on life or jobs or social classes, like in this movie. Actually, Alicia Malone of, I guess, TCM now. I know her back in the day when she did Profiles with Malone and Mance. Great show, by the way. She called it the opposite of the Cinderella story, the sort of riches to rags from Claudette Colbert's character. But aside from sort of the comedy and the romance, you're thinking, well, that's a romantic comedy, right? Well, these also have a bit of satire to it. If you look at something like His Girl Friday, like I said, another episode that I covered, another movie I covered, you look at a movie that has this sort of underlying theme that is not really discussed too much about, but in that theme, the satire, sort of the criticism of the newspaper and sort of the commentary, I guess, of the newspaper industry. And then you look at this one, it's sort of the commentary on social classes. I mean, you have this beautiful, sort of rich woman who flees and doesn't want to live this life, and then it's all over the newspapers and everything. So sort of that idea of the media frenzy in that sense. And then also in a lot of these screwball comedies, you see fast-paced dialogue and really witty characters. That was a really big appeal for me, is sort of the fast-talking, really witty characters that has an elevated sense of dialogue. A lot of people point to something like His Girl Friday for its crazy fast dialogue, and that one has really fast dialogue. But this one also has fast dialogue as well, along with being, some very interesting set pieces as well. But aside from being a screwball comedy, it's also a road movie. I recently just saw Harold and Kumar go to White Castle, and they are, whether they know it or not, are heavily inspired by this movie. Yes, there's the screwball comedy, which has sort of morphed into the romantic comedy, I would say, nowadays. But also, the road movie. This is a road movie where we see things like this in something like The Sure Thing, or like I said, Harold and Kumar, where there's sort of these unlikely pairing. They come together to achieve things, and they have sort of an admiration towards one another at the end of the day through the road sort of setting, which gives them a unique sort of benchmarks that they can hit. There's a destination at the end, and this movie sort of helped build that, helped formulate this movie type formula of having these two unlikely characters come together, achieve things, have some, some parts where they're away, have some parts where they're close together, sort of the trials and tribulations, with that sort of reaching distance in the end. But also, aside from sort of the genre-defining moments that this movie really created from a historical perspective, a lot of amazing trivia actually came out from this movie. So this movie is also famously noted as winning the big top 5 Oscars, which only 2 other films have done. So the big top 5 Oscars are Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, Best Actor, and Best Writing. So it was only nominated for those 5. It won all those 5. So this movie won those top 5. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won, and Silence of the Lambs. So sort of a unique club that they're in. But that just shows the sort of interesting sort of factor of it, because as an Oscar guy, it's interesting to see this sort of funny and wacky type movie win so many Oscars and do so well at the Academy, despite, the Academy is always sort of a snooty, sort of highbrow type of movie, and see essentially a comedy here was really crazy. And even looking back into the history, I mean, when Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, they were not actually the first 2 choices for the movie. It went through multiple people who turned down the script over and over again, until they finally, signed on, and they thought they hated the movie, that they thought they were making a terrible movie while they were making it. Colbert got nominated for the Oscar, and she still thinks she wouldn't have won because it was so bad. And then she won. She didn't even show up to the ceremony until someone had to sort of drag her there an hour before. She was almost about to miss it. So just this interesting thing where everyone, even the critics at the time that first came out, they were like, yeah, it was a pretty good movie, but it didn't really resonate with the audiences the way they thought, until it sort of made its way to the middle of the country, and sort of, not critics, the real people started seeing it, and word of mouth really sort of allowed this film to pick up, almost like a modern day Greatest Showman, and really allowed it to pick up and just sort of gain this following that eventually led it to the Oscars. Maybe because they found it a little more relatable, it's hard to say, but it's so interesting to see a movie that everyone hated making and didn't like doing it, not because it was a tough shoot, because they thought it was going to be bad, and then to get surprisingly good kind of reviews, but not amazing reviews, to then sort of getting this amazing audience following, and then for it to win those 5 Oscars, huge success rate happened one night. And actually, one of the strangest urban legends, I guess you can say, surrounding this film was that in a scene where Clark Gable takes off his shirt, he doesn't have an undershirt. So that became almost like a fashion trend. And they say that like a bunch of men's dress shirts or undershirts started to decline, sales started to decline, which, is probably not entirely sort of due to the reason of this movie, but the movies do have sort of this cultural appeal to it. So people probably saw Clark Gable not wearing an undershirt, and they're like, yeah, why do I need an undershirt, right? So this unique kind of phenomenon that happened there. Sort of a weird little tidbit that I love, and love reading about these classic movies and sort of understand the time period they came out and how that affected, and why it's a classic today, which is kind of the reason why I started this series in general. So now let's move over into why I love this movie. So despite it being sort of a genre-defining moment, you would think maybe it's a little bit dated. However, it's totally not. What I love really most about this movie is how funny it is. For a lot of comedies, even if I look back into the 70s or even in the 80s, some comedies don't resonate, because a lot of those comedies at times were very much reliant on the period that they were watching it. That's why some of my favorite comedies are Seth Rogen movies or Will Ferrell movies, where I'm watching them now and I get the references and I get sort of the humor, and they work really well for me. But it really tells you sort of a testament to something of a comedy that's able to withstand age and is sort of a timeless comedy, and this one most definitely is. I would even say it's more of a comedy than is a romantic movie. So many romantic comedies today are just romance, and they're not funny at all, and even the romance is spotty at best. But this one really has a great center of it, because it has these really funny moments, really incredibly witty dialogue, but then also there's the chemistry, the connection between Gable and Colbert and their sort of relationship, and how you start off seeing Gable's perspective of how this is a spoiled brat and he has to do everything for her, but he definitely has sort of a thing for her at the beginning, and then as he sort of just has a disdain for her, she starts getting onto him, and she's happy when she wakes up, and she's sort of thankful for all the stuff that she's doing. And then you see sort of an ulterior motive that Gable has to stay with this woman is because she's on the run, and not because of the reward, but because he's a newspaper man and he wants to get an exclusive story, so he's sort of staying with this woman. But then also the way Capra tells the story is so elegantly done, the way he moves through how it's the typical story of the hatred of the couple that eventually come together. But unlike something like His Girl Friday, which is a little bit different, it doesn't have that story necessarily, that sort of arc. I actually bought the connection. I bought the sort of way you can see the slow morphs into the way they start loving for each other, and they start really having an admiration for one another, compared to sort of the hatred and love and sort of that clashing feelings. And you see parts where they're completely separate, and you have parts where they're together. And really, I guess my favorite character would be Clark Gable, just because he exudes charm and charisma. He's incredibly smart in this movie. He just knows every way to get out of his situation, and just thinking on their feet. It's sort of a spontaneous movie, and in the same sense that I think this is a great movie to enter into. It's got a great fast pace. It's really accessible. It's funny. It still holds up to today. So if you're starting to get to classic films like I am, I thought this was a great one to see for yourself and really allow yourself to watch, because I was such a big fan of the movie. I think that it has a modern day sensibility and sort of ahead of its time in that sense. And I just felt that it's this great amalgamation of these great two performers who have an incredible connection with one another, witty, well-written dialogue in a great sort of atypical, formulaic, nowadays, but still well done and revolutionary at its time story that still holds up. It's not dated. There's still those funny lines that hold up, like I said, and the connection's there for sure. And you buy it, and it's all believable. And it sort of gets swept away by the movie, and the hour 45 goes by pretty quickly. So overall, I'm a fan of it. Happened One Night. I think you should check it out. Another thing quickly I want to mention is actually the sexual raunchiness to it. I mentioned the Hays Code before, but this has got in just before it, kind of, and sort of allude to these lot of things that almost throughout the entire movie, they're alluding to the idea of sex and whatnot without actually explicitly saying it, so that it has sort of a raunchy aspect to it, not like a modern day raunchy, but sort of a unique classic film way raunchiness in that sense. Of course, you have the famous lifting up the skirt to show the leg scenario, but there's this great living with another person, sort of how they live and that dynamic. But I still say I recommend this movie. See it for the great connection between the two leads, the incredible writing and the dialogue between one another, and just sort of the fast-paced nature to it. It's an easy watch. It's not that too long of a movie. I recommend it. But anyways, guys, for all those reasons, that's why I really enjoyed this movie. And make sure to stay tuned next week. I think next week I'm going to be covering Midnight Cowboy, so that should be a fun one. But if not, maybe if you want, comment below, let me know some of your favorite movies that you want to watch that maybe I have never seen before, and then maybe I can cover them on the series. I also put a lot of effort into, I guess it would be a few days ago now, John Ford episode of Masters of Controlled Chaos, which I put a lot of effort into. Make sure to check out that video, like that video as well, and share it with your friends, and so we can get this great film community going. So anyways, guys, I'm Connor Old, and until next time, stay tuned.